you may have seen, Buster did make a public statement. So we decided that tonight's episode will be all about the Stephen Smith investigation and all that is to come with that. But first, going to just introduce ourselves. My name is Hannah. This is Luke and Brian Sheely of the Sheely Law Firm here in Columbia, South Carolina, also located in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is Bring the Jury VOD Pod.
Bring the jury.
Bring the jury. So yeah, I guess let's just start from the beginning. The Stephen Smith death investigation is being reopened. And so what happened? Back in July 2015, there was a hit and run investigation for the pertaining to the death of Stephen Smith, who was found on a country back road in Hampton, South Carolina. He suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and that's kind of where, and it was all just ruled a hit and run, but there are definitely some suspicions, lots of unanswered questions, and so that is kind of what lays ahead.
Yeah, we'll take this kind of investigation, and there's no charges, and so a lot of what we discuss on this pod are criminal charges of significance here locally, and then throughout the nation, but we can't ignore what's happening here in our own backyard. And so basically, this, as most of the viewers know, was kind of wrapped up into the Murdaugh investigation. And there's a lot of press coverage and blog coverage about the Stephen Smith murder, as it's somehow associated. I don't think that can be proven at all, but basically SLED made an announcement that during the course of their investigation with Maggie and Paul, they were reopening this particular investigation. And why SLED does what it does, I don't know. They had closed the investigation as an unsolved hit-and-run fatality. Not a murder case that was unsolved, but a hit-and-run situation. And then they decided to make a press release that they had discovered something, or there was some reason for them to reopen the investigation, something associated with charging of Alex Murdaugh. But no one, after lots of reporting and coverage, seems to know what that information was, unless they just decided to take a new look at everything.
Could it be brought on by all of the media coverage? Like,
sure,
I know
sure.
There's the Netflix documentary that talks about it. The HBO special, I think, has a nod. And then, as most of you know, Mandy Matney does a lot of coverage specifically on Stephen Smith's.
Yeah, definitely. It could just be SLED feeling the international eye on them. And there's a lot of,
Well, there's certainly a lot of appetite.
There is appetite
for the consumption of Murdaugh news, which of course we covered. But there's, if SLED is reopening an investigation, there's certainly a reason why Alan Wilson, after day one of the Murdaugh trial, decided to show up and be present at the prosecution table. And it wasn't because they needed him, but it was a political opportunity. You're the Attorney General's office, so where's the Attorney General? And at the very end, he did do a witness and did quite well. But there certainly is a law enforcement appetite for all things Murdaugh. There's certainly a public, nationwide, international appetite. And so if Ms. Smith wants to retain lawyers to pursue a claim as she's doing, and
well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what happened back then before we get to that. The facts on the ground before the case was reopened were this. Basically there was this hit and run scene where there's someone driving down this rural road in Hampton County. I feel like we've kind of heard this story before, and they see a white male in the road. Law enforcement gets called, and I've got a copy of something that's readily available on the internet. It's a trooper's partially redacted, incomplete investigative summary. And I don't even know who the trooper's from, but it it does cover, this is something that we see a lot in our criminal practice, law enforcement's investigative report. And it basically helps us kind of set the scene for what they observed. And basically the troopers are out on the scene along with the coroner. The coroner at the time was Ernie Washington. And basically the troopers are looking at Stephen Smith, who has kind of a blunt force trauma injury to his right temple. The way this report reads, it's not like it doesn't sound like it's a massive amount of trauma all over the body, like maybe you would experience in an accident case where someone gets struck on the road and they get dragged around or run over. This seems to be fairly acute.
Right. Mm-hmm. And they're referencing it as being an entry point or some trauma to the right side above his brow. So not obvious broken bones or disfigurement or road rash like you might see if you were hit by a car.
Right. And here's the really interesting part is that the coroner, Ernie Washington, and the assistant coroner, Kelly Green, are on the scene describing it as a homicide. Coroner Ernie Washington is saying that he's showing the trooper a gunshot wound. Kelly Green, the assistant coroner, is showing this particular trooper defensive injuries to the hand. And then this trooper is kind of canvassing the area and not seeing, in his opinion, any evidence that he normally associates with a hit and run fatality, like a tail light broken or a front light broken or some kind of piece of a vehicle or brake marks or skid marks. And he's also noting that Mr. Smith's shoes are loosely tied on his feet. And if they're hit by a car, I guess the assumption is that they would be flying around. Luke, a lot of people don't really know the difference between a pathologist and an elected coroner.
Right.
So when this coroner is giving his opinion, Luke, help the listeners kind of figure out, what does that mean in your opinion?
It's virtually worthless.
Wait, say that again. What does that mean? You mean when he's pointing out entry wound is worthless? What do you mean?
Well, I'll say this. So in South Carolina, our coroners are elected. And
that's why he's the mean chili.
They run for office, and sometimes they're unopposed, but they politically seek a job that allows them to do an integral function of society, which is help. And whenever there's a death in South Carolina, it has to be investigated and decided for insurance purposes, law enforcement purposes, all kinds of purposes. Basically, whether it was an accident, whether it was self-inflicted, whether it's a homicide. And so the coroner doesn't have to be a medical doctor. I don't know that there's really any educational requirements. There might be some minimal ones, but certainly you don't have to be a medical doctor or a pathologist. So a lot of it is paperwork and putting out statements and checking a box regarding a manner of death. But they get that information from a pathologist who is a medical doctor, and not just a general practitioner, but someone who is board certified and skilled and trained, some of which we heard, of course, if you guys recall from the Murdaugh trial, we heard from two of them, one for the state, one for the defense. But they spend thousands of hours training how to determine a mechanism of injury, a cause of death. They can't tell you who did it, but they receive the body to dissect and analyze, and they're trained at looking at like one. So when the coroner gets out, coroners are frequently sometimes on scene, especially depending on the ruralness of a county and what they have going on. But other than the fact that they have the ability to look at bodies quite a bit, being around morgues and in conjunction with the pathologist, they don't really have any medical training necessarily. And I don't know anything about Coroner Ernie here, but I would doubt that he has Ernie Washington, but I doubt that he had any medical training, but probably has seen a lot of bodies and thought it was suspicious and maybe was applying his common sense.
And didn't we hear from the coroner in the Murdaugh trial who tested the armpit?
Right. That one did a approximate time of death to determine based on thermometer, armpit test, and that was kind of widely debunked in the course of the trial by pathologists. But they just kind of serve a function of the government to check a box based on gathering general information, and they're a conduit for law enforcement and other people, because when people die, they're constantly looking for information on their loved ones, and they're part of the bureaucratic, gatepost of that process. So, all that being said,
so we get this trooper who is very much believing that this is not a hit and run in his experience. He's hearing on the scene from the coroner and the deputy coroner that they believe it's a homicide. They believe it's a gunshot wound to the head. There's no information about caliber of weapon, that kind of thing. So this kind of gets this trooper thinking that that's what's happening based on his experience.
And it's very clear from this report that we can go through a little more. This trooper is pretty much beside himself, wanting to firmly contest the concept that this is a traffic accident. Now, troopers, their bread and butter in South Carolina are traffic accidents. They're the best at it. Vehicle collisions, deaths when people are hit by cars and injured, and they do a MATE report, which is kind of a comprehensive, scientific report. Some of their more highly trained ones do. They help determine the speed of impact, skid marks. They're able to recreate a scene, but the thing that they have less experience with than other law enforcement is they don't really deal with murder cases that much. They don't have much experience looking at gunshot wounds and determining whether it's a contact wound or a shotgun blast. They do DUIs, traffic tickets, death scenes about vehicular collisions, but less often are they going to deal and determine and investigate murder cases. So I could see why this might be exciting to this particular trooper.
Right. So this trooper basically, he is calling off the MATE team because he's hearing on the scene it's a homicide, it's not a hit and run. We don't need a major accident investigation. This is just a killing with a firearm. So he kind of, he's leaves the scene, he's doing his other duties, but he comes to find out from the pathologist, because basically he's talking to SLED. They do their own investigation as well. And, this is going to be Brittany, I believe Burkett, or Brittany Burke and Trey Talon, these two agents, and they're looking at the scene and their experience of going, yeah, this is a hit and run accident. We don't find anything that would make us believe that this is a head wound due to a gunshot. We're not seeing the hallmark signs of that. And so this trooper, per his report, basically calls the pathologist directly, because they're referencing the pathologist. And her name, what is her name, Luke? Erin Presnell, yeah. And she's at the medical university, and of course she's going to be highly qualified, but he calls her up.
Hey!
And this is all per his report, and he is challenging her on, why are you calling this a hit and run fatality? And she says, well, because I don't see any gunshot, I don't see any fragments in Mr. Smith's brain. She's looking at x-rays, there's no bullet wounds or no fragments, and so she's doing her job, and it's clear in his report that he takes umbrage with that. And he's saying, well, why are you theorizing that this is a motor vehicle that caused a death? And she's saying, well, because I don't see any bullet fragments, and I've got a partially dislocated right shoulder. I've got a head wound, and he's in the middle of the road. It's your job to figure out, how he died, basically, and how he got there. And so this trooper basically hangs up the phone and goes back to SLED.
Yeah. So that I've noticed online on the Twitterverse and other places that particular kind of battle in the comment by a pathologist saying, hey, it's your job to figure out how he died, is causing a lot of people some heartburn. But it is correct, like in the sense that she is using her scientific training to go, the wound does not look like a bullet entry point. She's shaving the head. She's going to do all those things that a pathologist is supposed to do. And if you have an entry point, if there's no exit wound, then you're certainly going to have the bullet inside the head cavity. You're going to at least have fragments. And if she's not seeing that, and it doesn't look like an entry point, then she's going to be saying, well, this is my job. It's not like she's going to tell, this trooper how to write a DUI ticket. So he's kind of challenging her. And what she is saying is, I'm determining it's not a bullet wound. It's not a gunshot wound. But I can't tell you how he got on that road. I can't tell you what part of a truck hypothetically hit his body. I can't tell you if it was some other puncture wound. It's your job, investigator, to figure that part out, is what she's saying. So, for the kind of the online world to think that she's not doing her job or that she's lazy, I don't think that's exactly fair, because she's just saying, I only know what's on my table right here.
Right. And so basically this trooper, hearing this information, calls back the coroner, and the assistant deputy coroner is like, hey, what gives? You told me this was a gunshot wound to the head. Now I'm hearing different things from SLED and this pathologist. What's going on? And basically the coroners have now backed down and have changed their opinion. And per this trooper's report, the coroner is saying, well, it's the doctor's call. And yeah, it is the doctor's call. But this would make for an interesting report to have, anytime there's a change in opinion, whether it's only like a perfunctory kind of role, but necessary from a coroner who doesn't have any medical training, to all of a sudden the trooper hearing it's a homicide to a hit and run, and he's thinking, I don't see any pieces in the road. It would be something that would make a lot of people be concerned, potentially. However, so let's talk about the other things that are going on with Mr. Smith. He's got his cell phone in his pocket. He's got the keys to his car in his pants pocket as well. His vehicle is on the side of the road, up the road. His body is positioned about, halfway between his vehicle and where he lives in this area. His gas cap is open. There's oil in the car. Law enforcement apparently tries to start the car, I guess with his key, are unable to start it. So it does appear to be disabled in some way.
So those are things that would corroborate the general concept that he would have been walking from a disabled car, where he had at least been assessing the gas situation, and perhaps been hit at night, whereas we didn't find a shell casing or a projectile or gunshot residue or anything like that would kind of further, corroborate a gunshot. Now, obviously it doesn't rule out kind of the wilder conspiracy concept where he could have been kidnapped, he could have been abducted, killed in some other location, and then brought back to make it look like he was walking. But it's still, you'd be very hard pressed to then say, well, how does a pathologist not know her job? Because it's one thing to have pathologists sometimes disagree about, the angle or whether something, we had a big disagreement in this Murdaugh case about Paul's head wound and whether it came from a low angle up across his shoulder, or
episode,
right, or whether it was from
or
whether it was from the top of his head in the form of a contact wound. But everybody said it was a shotgun wound. They just disagreed about the angle, and that was pretty rare that you see pathologists go 180. But it would be phenomenally rare for, and we're going to talk about what's happening in the exhumation request, but it'd be phenomenally rare for a pathologist to go, oh yes, that's a bullet wound, when one said it completely just wasn't a bullet wound. So to have causes of death so far apart,
it would have to be the ultimate fantastical cover-up corruption situation. For a pathologist to look at an entry wound of a gunshot and just say there's no fragments, there's no apparent entry wound. I did the x-rays, I did a full analysis of Mr. Smith's brain and found no, because what they do on these pathology examinations on a head wound is they basically peel back the brain. They take it out, they're looking everywhere, they're dissecting it, and they're doing x-rays for metal. And so for this pathologist to get it that wrong, like Luke said, not just angles and that kind of thing, but just gunshot wound to the head versus zero gunshot wound to the head, it'd have to be something pretty significant. So that kind of brings us to what's happening now. Why are we talking about Stephen Smith? We're talking about Stephen Smith because everyone's talking about Stephen Smith. And that's mostly because his mother has, started, this is all very much covered because, there's a GoFundMe to have a privately retained pathologist take a look at Stephen Smith's body. Now, what do you have to do before you can take a look at the body? You've got to exhume the body. This was on the Today Show today covering, apparently attorney Eric Bland is going to be representing Stephen Smith's family in this process. I mean, for those of you that may have an idea about this, you can't just go dig up a body, even if it is your family member. You have to get a court order, or law enforcement can seek an order to do this. It doesn't appear that this is being done by SLED. This, per the press release today by Mr. Bland, it seems like he's going to be petitioning the court for this process. And maybe it'll be, SLED will be kind of nodding their head to this. I mean, but it's not a SLED law enforcement search warrant order. I mean, for them to do it, they'd have to be talking about probable cause. What do we have that's going to help us have a judge do something really significant to dig up a grave, to exhume a body for the purposes of a new pathology examination? So this is not SLED doing this. This is going to be a privately retained attorney.
Right, and I don't think SLED will certainly object. They might even, if this is granted and there's an exhumation done and an autopsy being performed, 7 years later, they will probably certainly have, I don't know if they'll have a pathologist around, but they'll certainly have people to document via photograph, take notes, and be on scene probably to see if there's any discoveries, because you really only get one crack at this. And again, the body, I'm no expert, but the body is going to be 7 years past, and it depends on the condition and preservation and everything else. You don't exactly know what you're finding, whether it's literally just bones or whether it's somewhat preserved, but it's going to be, anybody could say it's going to be less good than what Dr. Presnell had the day she did the autopsy. But it's a rare thing. I mean, I don't know if you want us to tell stories about our past experience.
Yeah, I was going to ask, have you guys ever requested to exhume a body?
Yes.
Yes.
And was it granted?
No.
Okay.
So, I mean, we once had a homicide by child abuse case, very tragic, very sad, where a 2-year-old child was dead, and we represented the father, and we had hired a pathologist to kind of assess the situation, very much do what pathologists can do at that point after an arrest, and a year or so into a case is they can look at photos, they can read reports, but they can't literally see and assess for themselves 100%. So what our particular pathologist was requesting of us was that, hey, I don't think the original pathologist looked at this particular mechanism. He thought it could be almost like a child's stroke. He had a very particular name for it, almost a type of aneurysm that comes from a certain heart condition that he really couldn't rule out, that he didn't think was properly assessed in the original autopsy. So he said, look, I can't, and this was high stakes poker. This was a very serious case. The prosecution was looking for certainly a life sentence. And so on behalf of our client, we made that motion. And it's a tough thing to do, to ask a judge to do that. Because in this case, the Stephen Smith case, you've got the living relative, the mama, she's all on board. So you don't have any opposition. In our case, the prosecution and the mama were not on board. And I was doing it on behalf of my client, an unusual request. and it was not well received.
I think I remember the judge saying, bailiffs, lock the courtroom doors.
Lock the doors. We have a joke where this particular judge used to call...
These guys are twins.
We're twins, and he would call me
Let you guys know that first.
the bad Sheely, and Brian was the good Sheely, and that's literally where it came from. I was making that motion. I was the bad Sheely for quite a while until we made a joke, but it was denied. And that was that. But, the state has had more success doing it. And part of my basis for making that motion in the past was that the prosecution, not that previously, had made the same motion in a similar child death case for a similar reason, but to aid the prosecution of a defendant. And that motion was granted. So, anyway, make of that what you will.
And let's talk about...
No, go ahead.
Well, I may be moving on past what your question is.
I was just going to say, so let's say that they are granted permission to exhume Stephen Smith's body. What happens if there is something that is discovered, like novel information?
Well, so I want to talk about that a little bit, but I also want to talk about Eric Bland when he files in his press release today, he's going to file a petition to do this. And so I think a lot of people even though this has nothing to do with the Murdochs at this point in time, maybe like, oh, well, that'll go before Judge Newman, right? He was assigned by our Supreme Court to handle all the Murdoch criminal allegations. Well, this is not a pending charge. This would not necessarily, in my opinion, be before Judge Newman unless it was specially requested before him because he's got a lot of knowledge about I think this attorney would have to just file it before a circuit court judge with jurisdiction down in Hampton County, and he'd have to file it before one of the rotating assigned judges of the circuit. So it's not necessarily going to be Judge Newman. I don't know why. I don't know under what mechanism they would try to get him involved, because that would be that'd be cart before the horse in terms of...
Yeah, other than the rumor mill that tries to link it to Buster Murdoch, and he put out a very strong statement today.
We're going to talk about that.
There's no causal connection. It's just a request by a family that will be heard in the county where he died.
So let's talk about the exhumation process. So this will be very expensive. And, a privately retained pathologist would have to be made available. And apparently that person is already in place. So they would have to take the body, transport it to this pathologist examination room, wherever they're located, or whether they're going to be going into another examination room that's more local. And we have no idea who the identity of pathologist is, but let's say Luke's already discussed what they're looking for. They're going to look for, clearly they're going to look for a second opinion on a bullet wound. So they're going to be looking for kind of like that telltale kind of entry wound, exit wound, fragmentation, metal, damage consistent with that after 7 years. They're going to be able to do that. And so let's just say they find something of significance that would completely contradict the first pathologist. Well, that's a real big matzo ball, because what that does is, it's not just a difference in angles, Luke. It's a whole different cause of death. Got it so wrong. In head wounds and gunshot wounds are pretty obvious. There's metal going into body. So that would be a total contradiction between a state pathologist and whoever the privately retained pathologist is. Here's the other contradiction. It'd also be a massive contradiction between the first... Now, this is a SLED reopening of an investigation into Stephen Smith. It would be the SLED agents on the ground in July of 2015 got it wrong. And SLED would have to deal with that, because presumably a pathologist, if they make a finding that there definitely was a bullet wound, an entry wound, damage caused by metal, they would present it to SLED to incorporate it into their investigation. And so you got to, number one, you're going to have a pathologist that SLED believes. It's going to have to be someone highly qualified, highly credentialed. It'd be best if it was somebody in state, to be honest. I mean, we saw how out-of-state pathologists were kind of, cross-examined in the Murdaugh trial.
Boy from Connecticut.
Yeah,
Some Yankee. What do you know about?
Well, I think the guy was trained up north, but he was part of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. But bottom line is, if SLED believes a pathologist who determines there's a gunshot wound, it would basically say that SLED screwed up initially. And so if you bring about a case into a murder where SLED screwed up on the front end, it just gives, if someone ever gets charged, it gives them a lot to work with. Luke, what other kind of physical evidence could a pathologist be trying to preserve for other kinds of forensic examination in an autopsy?
I mean, it would be hard to say that they missed, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you'd be looking for hair, fibers. I mean, I read some reports where they found some blue paint chips on part of Stephen Smith's body that they went so far as to test and compare and matched certain Toyotas of a certain year. But but that never went anywhere, and that's consistent with a vehicular accident. So
now, just because it's a vehicular accident doesn't mean it's unintentional. It just makes it not a gunshot.
It could have been run over, and it could have been with intent, and that could be murder. But again, the fact that this pathologist originally says it's not a gunshot wound just because the trooper thought it could be, and that the non-medically trained coroner thought it was, doesn't mean it's not a murder. The question is, if it is a murder, who did it? But if it's not a murder, then let it stay a tragic accident. And so that's what the hoopla is all about.
Well, here's the other thing. Legally in South Carolina, let's say it is a tragic accident where Stephen Smith is walking down the road and gets hit by someone who's not paying attention or doesn't see Mr. Smith because it's dark. If you fail to stop and render aid or call police knowing that you've hit someone, that's a major felony. And you can go away for a long time if they can match the identity of the vehicle to someone. I mean, that is a serious penalty in South Carolina, and it could be something that even starts as reckless can be criminal if you don't stay on scene, don't call 911, don't report it. Luke, do you think there's any DNA evidence at this point? I know you've done a lot of DNA work. Could be preserved and analyzed?
Nope.
Well, tell everybody your thoughts on that, because I'm sure that's going to be a question. What if?
it would have
what if his assailant? Let's say there is an assailant had.
There's not going to be any touch DNA, touch DNA from my fingers on this table on a surface like a gun or metal, glass. But if he was in a physical struggle, I guess he says there's some reference to defensive wound. So maybe, just maybe, if it hasn't decomposed after 7 years, I can't imagine a pathologist wouldn't have scraped fingernails as a matter of course. But if they didn't, because they didn't view it as a defensive wound, they viewed it as road rash. And so they didn't scrape fingernails. And let's say that a new pathologist scrapes fingernails on what could be a questionable defensive wound, then maybe. But I just don't know how much actual non-degraded biological material you're going to have after 7 years. Maybe. But a drop of blood would be more likely that somehow a pathologist would just ignore, and then you have to figure out, there's going to be, if he had a funeral, he's going to be cleaned, he's going to be, I don't know anything about the circumstances of the casket, open or not, but there's so much I can't talk today, contamination of evidence that you almost would think that there's hardly any, other than saying it's a bullet wound or not, that there may not be any forensic evidence of value.
So, I'm sure this will be making headlines. just due to how sensationalized everything in that part of the low country of South Carolina is nowadays. But apparently there will be a court petition. And so with a court petition, there'll be, I'm sure, a lot of media coverage of that. I'm sure we'll be following that along. And so once the petition is granted, there's always a chance a judge could not grant it. But if you've got the consent of the mom, you've got law enforcement nodding to it, maybe even joining in a motion. Of course, the thing about that is, why wouldn't they just go ahead and be the one moving? Why would they not be the state moving before court based on evidence, meeting probable cause threshold to get a judge to order an exhumation in the course of their criminal investigation? That's not really a hard thing to do. They have to have something, probable cause. It's a very low burden.
Well, I think it's because they don't have that.
Well,
they're happy to let they're happy to let the family do it on their own, just through their consent. That they're the family. They've raised money. May we please do it? We're going to do it in a safe environment. We're not going to contaminate. We're not going to desecrate human remains unnecessarily. We're not going to disrupt any other graves. We just need to answer this question. So yeah, that makes it easy for SLED, and then they can look and peek and go, well, let's document while we're here and see what we see. And the question is, if the pathologist says, yes, here's why I'm a better doctor and I'm looking for XYZ signs, and it is a atypical type bullet entry wound, all right, fine. Who did it? That doesn't get, SLED would then have to figure that out. And you can't arrest based on rumor and speculation. You need proof, or you should need proof. And so you're kind of back to square one. But it would be sensational for a pathologist to make that assessment credibly, because we're not talking about a disagreement about angles. We're talking about a death by bullet wound or death by a vehicle.
And here's the thing. If you are a pathologist at the Medical University of South Carolina that gets something like this so wrong, then you do not need to be doing this type of work anymore. And that's just it. If you are that wrong on a cause of death, then you don't need to be doing this.
So I'm sure this pathologist is just from what you can find on the internet, is just flooded with annoying calls and emails and messages. And I guarantee you she wished that nothing ever happened with the Murdaugh family and she'd never heard of it, because it's a huge pain in her butt. And that's, of course, the fact that we're talking about it right now doesn't help her either. But it's just one of those things. So, it would take some bizarre laziness, corruptness. The conspiracy wheels will turn and people will say, well, they're such a powerful family in that part of the world. They could make a call and get people to render this or that opinion. And that's a lot of speculation.
And the other very, very likely part of this is that the request to exhume Stephen Smith's body will be granted, and they'll have a privately retained pathologist look at it and find nothing associated with homicide other than blunt force trauma, likely with a vehicle. And so I guess the question is, well, that doesn't necessarily close the door to a criminal charge. It just means that it wasn't a gunshot, and that you would have to then connect who didn't stop in the vehicle, who hit this young man and left him for dead on the side of the road. Because that's still a major criminal case in South Carolina that could put someone behind bars for a long, long time. So then that becomes a whole other investigation piece.
Has it been ruled out, though, that it couldn't have been like a hammer, a rock, a bat?
No, I guess the first pathologist she's calling it blunt force trauma. Now, she's not saying, she's theorizing, per this very angry trooper, that it's most likely, I guess, from a vehicular trauma. And he's like, well, how are you saying it's that? And she's like, that's your job, buddy. So I guess no. I guess other types of blunt force trauma couldn't be ruled out. And I'm sure if the privately retained pathologist, that's a good point, says, well, no to the gunshot wound. So the first pathologist is not losing her job. It's not a gunshot, but it could be something else other than a vehicle, like a bat or a brick or a hammer or a large stick. Okay.
So here's some report we pulled today detailing it with quotes from the trooper and noting a SLED report saying it was unclear at the time whether the hole was caused by a projectile, and then they're questioning, well, could it have been, the doctor said it was a hit and run based on it being found in the middle of the road. She had no evidence other than the statement being put in the report, and the investigator asked the pathologist if someone with a baseball bat could have caused the injury, and she said no. And then the investigator said, well, what if it was a wound was made by being struck by a bat or other object held by someone in a moving vehicle? And this quote, whether it's right or not, says the pathologist answered, well, I guess it's possible, and asked if a bat had been found as evidence. So it's like, well,
kind of putting it back.
Maybe, but did you find a bat?
Right,
So
right.
it's like,
So then the question becomes, well, does SLED have a bat somewhere that they
Found.
have found or
And that's
collected,
like-
and they're trying to...
doubtful.
Well, but now they have access to, I mean, they've combed through Paul's phone. I think Stephen Smith's phone was actually intact, which is surprising had he been hit by a moving vehicle. And they're requesting more like cell phone records, social media records, and all of that to kind of, I think, give somewhat of a roadmap for where to dive in. Like, who was he speaking to? What were his movements? Who did they contact next?
Yeah, I mean, the phone, as we know from the Murdaugh trial, is a great source of evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, so if they kind of ruled it, the investigation dead, as just an unsolved hit and run, and there's no need to look into the phone if it's not some kind of, malicious act necessarily. You don't need to say, well, who's he been talking to last? Did he call 911? Apparently his phone was like dead or powered down, but if you have a phone, you can power it up, and you can either have access to it through someone that knows how to open it up, or you can send it to the FBI, you can break it open, you can do a full Cellebrite extraction on it and get everything in the world off that phone.
Hindsight.
Yep, all that
Right.
stuff. And so as we saw in the Murdaugh trial, GPS data can be lost if it's not preserved properly. It can be used to show exactly where you've been if it's preserved properly. It seems very natural that his car broke down and he was walking home, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't some intervening factor that, we just don't know. So lots to think about in terms of, even a pathologist privately retained rules out gunshot, could still be something else, and they could certainly be asked to opine on that. But either way you spin it, SLED initially decided it was a hit and run with no malicious intent, like a murder case or something like that. They just called it a roadside fatality where someone didn't stop. So it's kind of built-in problems. If a criminal investigation ever does land on someone's doorstep, that defendant will have the ability to say, well, SLED says I didn't do it. They didn't get it right. And it'll give someone a lot of another stick to beat SLED with. And, I think SLED feels like they've been beaten up a lot. And that's why we saw after the Alex Murdaugh trial was over, Mark Keel got up and basically said, any crimes associated with Murdaugh, we're coming for you. Kind of in a very...
menacing.
Well, he definitely...
Ominous,
yeah. So...
kind of way.
So let's talk about... Hannah, do you have anything else?
No?
Okay.
You wanted to dive into the...
Well, I want to talk about we're not going to mention Buster, but he did give a statement today, so I feel like we can talk about that because we're not trying to spread rumors until there's evidence of anything. There's, it's like in the Murdaugh trial, though. Sometimes the absence of evidence, state would say is evidence. Not in this case, not in our opinion, but based on all of this, Stephen Smith kind of reopening, and then the Today Show was covering it. Eric Bland had a press conference. So, apparently Buster gave a statement today through Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffith. It was released right before Eric Bland's press conference. And basically, to paraphrase, it just said, I've had enough. I've tried to remain silent. I'm still grieving over the death of my mother and my brother. I love them dearly. And I'm trying to live a very private life right now. That's why I haven't given a statement into anything. I'm trying to be left alone, but due to this story, and he's referencing the Stephen Smith reopening of the investigation and a lot of the rumoring going on in the public eye, I'm going to make a statement. And I had nothing to do with it. And please leave me alone. I feel for his family, but I didn't have anything to do with it. And basically the last 3 or 4 lines says anything put out in the media would be defamatory. Mm-hmm. And it would be an absolute lie. And without evidence, and people keep on just associating him with this case with zero evidence, you get major media outlets talking about it. And there have been defamation lawsuits successfully won for way less. So he made a public statement today, so we'll talk about it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be mentioning his name. But basically saying, back off, I'm trying to be private, and this is crazy if you try to link me to it. Luke, what do you think?
Yeah, it's sad. He is a victim. He's grieving in multiple different ways for multiple different things, and good for him. He put it out there. He used the D word, the fame, and I think that's a trigger and should be a line in the sand and should make lots of media outlets and others' ears kind of tingle to back off because you could get your butt sued. And we've been following this situation for a while, and I've never heard anything remotely credible regarding a link to him and Stephen Smith. It's just kind of this appetite for consuming Murdaugh and Murdaugh public prosecution that people almost want it to be him, but you gotta follow the evidence, and you have to be very careful if you don't. So good for him. I'm sure he is exhausted. I'm sure he wants peace and wants to remain private.
I will ask you this, Luke. What do you make of that press release from Buster coming from Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffith?
I think, he testified for them on behalf of his father. They're clearly close. They represented his brother criminally. I'm sure they're someone that he leans on for legal advice, and probably when he caught wind of this, he was like, well, what do I do? How do I stop this? It's probably something like that. I don't know that it's anything more formal than that, and I'm sure they were happy to do it. So, well,
while we're talking about Jim Griffith, we're talking, Jim Griffith. I gotta say this. There was some other news today that was basically a jail phone call during the trial from Alex Murdaugh. As the trial was happening, that was released. I wasn't aware of it at all.
I haven't heard about this at all.
It was talked about today in social media where Jim is basically saying, yeah, that's me, and I'm furious about its release as it's attorney-client privileged. And so, we do have very, very strict rules concerning attorney-client privilege. However, if you call or receive a call from your client and it's a monitored line, and if anyone's ever called a jail or received a call from an inmate at a jail, there's always a disclaimer that says this is monitored call. It's recorded. So if you're an attorney talking to your client on a monitored call, then you waive attorney-client privilege. you're freely discussing something with your client that's privileged, knowing it's recorded. So it's very similar to, if I recall, in the Murdaugh trial, I can't remember exactly, but there was an objection because Jim was trying to say that something couldn't come in because he was in the room and there's a SLED agent or something, and Judge Newman, rightly so, said, listen, you waived attorney-client privilege when there is an agent in the room with you. And so it's the same thing here with these jail phone calls. Whether it's right or wrong, like Luke says, everything Murdaugh is, there's an appetite for it. Public consumption, ravenous public consumption for it. I mean, we're talking about it right now, but I will say this. It is a real big no-no for a lawyer to have a call with a client from jail and have any expectation of privilege. I mean, whenever we get a call from a client in jail, whether it's a murder case or a shoplifting case, I'm hanging that phone up. And I'm letting my clients know on the very front end that we are not going to speak to you on the phone. It waives privilege. We will come see you at the jail as much as possible. And, the substance of the call, I heard some of it. It didn't seem of any kind of real significance. I mean, it was just kind of talking about the day's lawyering and what was going on in trial, but you can't really expect to be upset that it's privilege when you've talked into a recorded line.
Correct. It's tough when you have a client in jail, especially in trial time or leading up to trial time. As a lawyer, you have to spend so many hours at the jail facility trying to prepare that client, whether they're going to testify or just discussing legal issues. And a lot of times the client is the best source of information. But we don't take jail calls for that very reason. We routinely, in big cases, get a dump of jail phone calls from the prosecution for years' worth of what our client has hopefully not stupidly said to his family, everything we ever told him not to discuss, which is anything about the case facts. It's what, you can't stop your client from saying, Mama, I love you. Did you send me some money on my books? Or, hey, baby girl, how you doing tonight? But you don't want to be talking lawyer strategy on the jail. And so it's just, you don't want to rely on the state's or the prosecution's concept of what is a privileged thing or not, and hope that then they're listening to your calls, so they go, oh, that's the lawyer, we better stop listening here. Now, whether that comes into evidence, don't know. It might be that a smart, kind judge keeps it out, but you're just creating problems down the road. And I know that there's some outrage on behalf of the lawyers here, but everything I read of it was obtained as part of a FOIA, after the trial. But the problem is, if there is a new trial, then anything he says on these lines potentially could be used against him.
Correct.
And so I was shocked to not really see any jail phone calls in this case, period, because the state typically loves to do it. I don't know if that was a particular thing that maybe the Attorney General's office didn't want to deal with in this case.
Well, I think after the initial dump of jail phone calls pursuant to FOIA of Alec Murdaugh talking to his family, I think there was pretty much a ceasing of that, and I bet the defense probably asked for an order on that issue. But we didn't. Yeah, we certainly didn't get any attorney-client anything. Apparently there was a phone call from the local jail in Walterboro, and you can't really be upset about it, honestly. So, any lawyers out there or wannabe criminal defense lawyers, go see your client. And there may be moments where you get a call and I'll talk to Mama. I'm not going to talk to you on the phone. I'll get the message through.
I'll see you tomorrow.
I'll see you tomorrow before court. Or if it's something really big, I'm coming down there right now. But you don't have a call on the jail and then say it's privileged. There was we could do a whole podcast, but there was a really big situation a number of years ago where there was an expectation of a lawyer of having a privileged communication with his client in the holding cell of a jail. And unbeknownst to him, the prosecutor was recording it. Now that's not waiving of privilege. That's a bad prosecutor where you think you're having a private conversation. And we can have a whole podcast on this. But
Man.
that was a terrible example of prosecutorial misconduct. So yeah, that lawyer had every right to be really upset, and that's a very notorious situation in South Carolina we can talk about. But he wasn't on a phone call; he was doing the right thing. He was down at the jail talking to his client, and got bugged essentially, and then that whole thing set off a firestorm in South Carolina. But that's not what Jim did, and so. Yeah, you can be outraged, but at the same time, you can't have any idea that that's privileged. What else we got? Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we had a few questions. A lot kind of pertaining to questions about Stephen Smith case. We don't have to maybe like get into hearsay or rumors or anything, but maybe just speaking to your experience with similar situations. So, first off, a lot of people are interested in knowing why that Randy Murdaugh and perhaps Alex, I'm not sure, showed up to the crime scene. And again, this has nothing to do, we're not saying anything about Buster or creating any rumor, but have you all had any experience with, I guess, talk about
No, that's odd.
people showing up to the crime scene
Again,
and it was under this umbrella of we want to help you and let us take this case for free.
You mean like some ambulance chasing?
No.
Yes. Someone said that earlier.
I can't speak with any true veracity on this, but I was going down a rabbit hole in the Twitterverse today, and the people were debating this, and somebody mentioned that, and I'm sure people will correct me on here if it's not right, but that Sandy Smith, young Mr. Smith's father, was a current client at the big law firm PM Ped, and that so when obviously Stephen Smith is deceased, that there was a call, like you call your lawyer, like what's going on? He's dead on the side of the road. Is it an accident? We don't know. And it was kind of like after the fact, while the crime scene, if it's a crime, but the scene was secured by law enforcement. So people were hotly debating that. I don't think it's gonna shape up where you've got the whole Paul Murdaugh boat crash allegation, which we saw fleshed out in the trial itself, where Alec is walking around with his law enforcement badge hanging out of his pocket and kind of talking to witnesses at the hospital and things like that. So I don't have like crystal clear knowledge on that, but I don't know that it's anything nefarious. Otherwise, Sled would have done a huge deep dive into it.
Well, I'll play devil's advocate. I think maybe in small town, rural Hampton, South Carolina, we're the largest firm in the area and maybe one of the largest firms in the state that does personal injury work, that does have a client whose son was just killed in an accident. Maybe in that reality you go down there, but in every other reality, even some bigger cities in South Carolina, like where we are currently in Columbia, or in other metro areas, Charlotte, Atlanta, you're not going down there. I don't care if the firm that you work for is representing the father of the son. And that just doesn't happen. Not night of. It doesn't happen. So like,
It's pretty strange.
people with national eyes looking on this are like, what are you talking about? Why in the world would they go down there? I mean, only in Hampton County would that be somewhat plausible. It's still, in my perception, a little odd because you just back off and you let law enforcement do their job. You got local troopers kind of at odds with Sled. You got a crime scene here, so it's only maybe plausible in that part of the world, but like no one else gets it. I'm on the fence about it. I think it's kind of odd, honestly. I just don't think that happens, even with a relationship with a client. I mean, we got lots of clients that even if we got the call that night, I'm not running down there. I'm just not doing it. I'm going to let law enforcement clear the scene. I'm not going to even know if there's anything to be done about a case.
Maybe you don't love your client.
Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't love my clients enough, but I just think that's odd. So yeah, my take on it is that's odd. And apparently it was Alec conflict, and his brother Randy, which makes it odd to me.
We've got some people who want to hear more about the attorney that was bugged.
We'll do that on another pod. Stay tuned. I mean, so I think it's public record in South Carolina. We can talk all about it, but it is. We'll have a whole future pod in very near future on attorney-client privilege.
Okay.
And violations of that.
Subscribe.
There, like and subscribe.
And if you
so
want
you
to
don't miss that content.
And if you want to be even more outraged by that, here's a tidbit: the attorney that was bugged ended up going to jail.
Right. So.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Tune in down the road.
So, Bring the Jury has a newly formed YouTube channel. So you can like and subscribe to that. It's Baby Fresh, as Hannah.
It is Baby Fresh, so it is a little difficult to find because I think we have like 3 subscribers. But it's Bring the Jury. You can find it easily kind of through some of our other platforms. Like if you go, it's on Twitter, but YouTube, Bring the Jury.
And you can go to Sheila Law, and
Yes.
a lot of our stuff is there as well. But we're going to be building up that YouTube. It's got some cool graphics and some other
Yeah, it's
things.
got some cool. I've been working on some graphics.
Produced by Hannah
Yeah.
here.
I'm the producer. I'm not a lawyer.
Thank God.
Thank God. Can you review the appeal process? So I guess circling back to Alex Murdaugh, and maybe where that is. I guess we kind of touched on that.
We can do it. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's.
Yeah, he's got
I hate to put you guys out.
the lawyers, Harpootlian and Griffin, had 10 days to file their notice of an intent to appeal. Because if you don't file that notice that you want to appeal, you lose that right. So that's very important. That's the placeholder that triggers it. And we've had every indication that they themselves, the trial lawyers, also want to do the appeal. That is less frequent, but does happen. I've done it once on one of my appeals. And then you can't do anything without a transcript. I mean, they know in their minds what a legal issue is, what they think they should really dive into, but you get certain deadlines to get your initial briefs in, to state what your claim is. The state of South Carolina will have a chance to respond to it through its appellate lawyers, and you go back and forth until you have briefed these issues for the First Court of Appeals of South Carolina. And they can take up your case and give you an oral argument, which would probably be likely in this because it has a lot of attention. They could decline to hear your case and say there is nothing here to see, or they could issue an opinion just without oral argument. If you don't like what the Court of Appeals has to say, you can petition to the Supreme Court. They can do the same thing. Take it up, hear it, decide an opinion without hearing it. Again, you might have oral argument here. If you lose and you've got a case that has massive due process constitutional issues, you can then try to appeal up to the Supreme Court of the United States, for example.
You got denied on that.
I went that far, and they did not want to hear, after 7 years of hard work, appearing twice in the Court of Appeals, once at the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court didn't want me to come up there and talk to them about my justice for my client. So anyway,
And so then after all the appellate process is done, there's always post-conviction relief proceedings that Alec Murdaugh gets to bite down on, where he then gets to say, well, all my appeals are exhausted, my lawyers are ineffective, that's why I am where I am. And so that's a whole nother process that he has to file. And, the Attorney General's office once again gets involved to dispute that. He would then have to hire certainly other counsel to help him with his post-conviction relief proceeding. We can say with certainty that it can't be Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, because they would have to be the ones that the fingers are being pointed at. A lot of folks get relief on post-conviction relief if their appeals are exhausted. So that's that process.
Do you all think that Buster, do you think he would be represented by Dick Harpootlian? Now that that statement was made, does it seem as though that's who he's seeking counsel from?
I think this is more of an informal thing. I don't know if something came of this investigation. Buster would want to be very cautious and would want to have an attorney. Whether he wants his dad's attorney, how messy that is. He was a witness in his dad's trial. I would say probably not be a good idea, but it's not my call. You never know.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we will end it there for tonight. We'll be back again next Monday night live. If you tuned in late or kind of had to miss certain parts, we do upload the full video to YouTube. Again, that is Bring the Jury podcast on YouTube. We will link it in the bio. You can also find us on Instagram, Sheely Law. We upload kind of like highlights, shorter clips, and other just information and stuff going on at the Sheely Law Firm. We're obviously on TikTok. We have 2 YouTube channels, just the Sheely Law Firm and then Bring the Jury, and then also both accounts on Twitter too, if you'd like to follow along there. And yep, this was Luke Sheely, Brian Sheely, and I'm Hannah, and thank you all so much for tuning in for our 12th episode of Bring the Jury.
All right.
And if there's any questions that you guys think of after watching this, just message us on this account, and Hannah can follow up with it, and we can have future things to talk about.
Yeah, or if there's any cases, I think I just saw someone asked about another case totally separate from Stephen Smith. You know, we've also talked about Idaho 4, but if you have cases that you're interested in, let us know. Send us a message, comment, anything like that about cases that you would like us to discuss. And we'd love to do that. So.
All right, guys.
Great. Thank you so much.